On one level, when it comes to an understanding of the relationship between music and technology, volume is one of the easiest concepts to grasp. From an early age, we learned that there are two buttons on the TV remote, one of which makes the level of what we're watching get louder, and the other of which turns everything down. Maybe our introduction to changing volume comes on a smartphone or portable speaker with the same kinds of buttons, or maybe we learn about volume in a more natural environment, getting frightened by a loud dog bark, or covering our ears when we pass people working with drills in the street. However that formative experience presents itself, volume seems simple. More is louder, less is quieter. But when we start making music and producing tracks, as with so many concepts, we discover that volume can become much more sophisticated if we want to broaden our knowledge and understanding. For instance, we'll soon discover that volume can be managed in a number of different ways. Maybe we experiment with synth plugins, which have an output volume control. But we also realise that our chosen workstation has a volume fader in its mixer section, and both of these controls let us change levels. Or maybe we're plugging microphones into an audio interface to make recordings, and it's only when we turn up the gain that we get a strength of signal that it's worth recording. We soon learn that there's a relationship between the different pieces of our recording ecosystem: the volume of the singer we're recording, the volume of the natural personality of the synth we're using, the volume added via plugins, and the volume we're able to bring when we balance a mix with volume faders and volume automation. All of these stages and all of these functions, all controlling volume level. This relationship is what we could broadly refer to as signal flow, which is how we describe a sound making its way from its origin to its destination. At a simple level, let's take the example of recording a vocalist. The signal flow would involve a singer performing into a microphone through an audio interface connected to a computer running recording software. The simple ways in which volume could be controlled would be like this. First, we could ask the singer to perform more loudly or quietly. Second, we could change the input gain level at the audio interface to control the volume sent to the computer. And third, once the recording is made and is captured in our computer, we could turn the volume fader up or down. But if we want to, we can make the same signal flow much more complicated. Having recorded that singer, we could process the sound in a number of ways, for instance. EQ boosts or cuts the volume of some frequencies within a mix whilst leaving other frequency areas alone. Compression changes the average level of a performance so that the volume gap between its quietest and loudest moments is made smaller. Saturation and distortion plugins add volume by adding to the number of harmonics in a sound, whilst introducing a reverb or delay plugin might make a sound quieter, as a portion of the signal is shared between a louder, dry signal and a quieter, wet one. So if we were to add a chain of effects to our recorded vocals, we're extending the signal flow of how that sound exists, and there are opportunities and implications for volume at every stage. We're also starting to understand two crucial volume stages: input volume, which we usually refer to as gain, and output volume, which we usually just call volume. Gain matters for a number of reasons. If you're a guitarist working with an amplifier, you'll know that the input gain stage allows you to control the level going into the amp, with higher gain resulting in some level distortion. This can either be subtle or extreme, but crucially, either approach to distortion is designed to overload the circuit within the amplifier to change the tone of the sound. Separately, the volume dial at the end of the signal chain then allows you to set how loud that distorted signal will be. This means that you can crank guitar signals into distortion without annoying your neighbours, as you'll have separate controls for input and output. It also means that you can distort the input signal without creating a level so loud that it's problematic to record through a microphone. A similar approach exists in most analog mixing consoles, where you'll find a trim dial at the top of each channel strip. This allows you to control the input stage of whatever signal you're feeding into that channel before you process it with EQ and compression, patch in insert effects, and ultimately balance the channel level with the volume fader at the bottom. Trim dials on mixing consoles matter for another reason too. The level of the signals we can plug in can vary hugely. Microphone and line level sources are probably the two most common signal types we might want to connect to either a mixing desk or, more commonly these days, an audio interface. Microphone levels are tiny by comparison with line level signals, operating at a fraction of the voltage. If you were to connect a microphone to a line level input, you'd barely be able to hear it, whereas a line level signal attached to a microphone input will distort immediately, as the gain structure for the possible uses of that channel vary so much. There are also high Z, meaning high impedance, inputs for bass and guitar instruments, which vary the sensitivity of a channel to ensure that signal flow is matched to the sound type at the source of any signal's flow. So the gain or trim dial is hugely important, whether you're using it for amplifier style tone control, as guitarists might, or if you want to record input volume in a clean way to capture the best possible recording. One really important thing to remember is that the volume fader for the channel you're recording to won't adjust input level. It sets the volume of the sound once it has been recorded. In other words, if you overload the input gain into distortion, the volume fader can't help. The damage is already done, as the distortion will be recorded. Alternatively, if you record a signal without enough gain, you'll have to boost the output volume significantly, which means you'll also turn up any noise or hiss captured with the actual sound you wanted to record. We call this relationship the signal to noise ratio. Signal is the part that you want, and noise is the rest of the sound captured at the same time. Nearly always we want as much signal as possible, alongside a minimum of noise. Gain is the dial to set that balance, with signals of around -3 dB to -6 dB, a good target to aim for when you're recording digitally. Next, we need to understand that volume levels are added together from one channel of a mix to the next. We've already discovered that overloading a single channel with too much input level doesn't sound good, but we can run into a similar problem at the output stage, even if no individual channel is too loud. If we take two channels of volume, which peak at -2 dB at the same moment in a track, for example, and we add those volumes together, we'll overload the output channel, pushing its level into the red. We refer to the volume gap between the loudest part of a signal and its potential maximum volume as headroom, and it's hugely beneficial to leave enough headroom, not just on individual channels, but when we're summing those channels down to submixes or sending them directly to the stereo output 2 bus. Again, use gain plugins, the volume faders, or volume automation to get levels under control. In a way, understanding signal flow and the impact on volume through a chain of effects is easier to understand when working with hardware. If you connect a guitar to a chain of stomp box effects with a gain input dial and a volume output dial, adjusting volume in and out of each device becomes straightforward, particularly if those hardware effects offer level meters using LED lights, with the last one, which is usually red, indicating signal overload. When we're chaining plugin effects together, we don't have to make those physical connections ourselves, and we aren't always so lucky with metering either. Whereas some plugins might have a similar ladder of LEDs to show the current level, others don't, which means that we easily forget that one effect is flowing into the next in the same way. Try to think about chains of plugins as you would hardware effects units and vary input and output volumes, as there are often really interesting sonic differences when we experiment with those levels. In fact, this is where metering can really help. Volume meters measure signal level without affecting volume themselves, often letting you monitor peak levels, which fluctuate moment to moment, and RMS levels separately, because they show the consolidated energy of a signal rather than momentary spikes in level. There are also loudness meters, which we use to measure LUFS. It can be interesting to use meters before and after a series of processes to see how volume changes at each stage of the signal flow. This is perhaps most important when you're mixing or mastering music, taking the sum of a number of individual channels or subgroups and printing a stereo master of your mix. At this stage, you're likely to reach for a chain of effects to control output volume, including stereo or multiband compression and brick wall limiting, to oversee the maximum volume for your mastered mix. Metering each stage of processing can help you see where and how much volume is being added. In a sense, an understanding of volume overlaps with an understanding of compression. Remember that compression changes the dynamics between the quietest and loudest points of a signal, so, of course, if we apply compression, we're changing volume. On this course, we'll touch on how compression and limiting relate to volume, but do check out the Science of Sound compression course if you want to know more about dynamics processing. Like many topics, volume can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. Often, we're in a rush to make things loud as volume can be so impressive. You'll know that when a friend pops into your studio to hear your current track, you're always going to reach for the volume dial to crank levels to ensure the mix is as exciting as possible. It's why gigs are loud too. We like to be bathed in volume. But through the production process, think about volume carefully and don't be in a rush to add as much as possible to every channel, submix, bus, auxiliary, or output channel. Take your time, structuring your mix with careful signal flow, gain management, and volume automation. It's not hard to add the hype and volume boost at the mix and mastering stages, but your mixes will benefit hugely if you're patient as you produce.